Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee with Craig, where we talk about all things firearms, firearms policy, politics, culture, media, you name it. We're talking about it right here on Coffee with Craig. So please take a moment, like and share the program so that your friends can join in the conversation. Also, if you haven't already done so, please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook. And in both cases, make sure you hit the notification button because you know they're trying to suppress us. So if you want to get the alerts as soon as we go live so that you can participate in the live chat, please make sure you hit that notification button. Also, please visit fpcgear.com. That's fpcgear.com. It is a cool place to find all sorts of Pro 2A swag, t-shirts, coffee mugs, hoodies, stickers, you name it. We've got all sorts of stuff, tons of stuff there with new designs coming up on a regular basis. And, you know, every dollar that you spend there goes right back into the fight for a right to keep and bear arms. So you can support the Second Amendment and you can look good doing it. That's fpcgear.com. Now, I probably told you this saying before, but my old college statistics professor had a saying. He's like, there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. Well, there's one other type of lies, and let's just be real. Anti-gun studies. In particular, those anti-gun studies that are done by, well, in the quote-unquote medical field. Now, first of all, we all know that those who generally do a lot of these studies in the medical field, they're not the best at doing research. They're really not, in particular, when you start talking about human behavior and talk about non-medical stuff. They're probably the absolute worst. And they also come into it with a sincere bias. They don't mean to come into it with a bias, but their bias is they hate guns and they want to find reasons to ban guns. Well, you guys may have seen or heard about recently over the last couple of weeks, a study that came out by the Academy of Pediatrics, or was promoted by the Academy of Pediatrics, basically saying that gun control laws reduce pediatric deaths, right? They're trying to say that it reduces the number of children that will die as a result of firearms, or in their case, they like to say gun violence. Well, I wanted to kind of question a little bit of that, and because there were a number of things, there were actually 4 things in particular that are some serious flaws with their particular study. And I wanted to point out and talk about what some of those flaws are. Now, the first issue that I wanted to address was the issue of, pediatric. What does pediatric means? And in their case, pediatric means deaths among all Americans aged 21 and under. Now, this is vitally important. Why is this vitally important? Because they want you to think they're talking about children, the little babies, right? They want you to think you're talking about elementary schoolers. But in most cases, when you're talking about deaths relating to firearms, you're talking about individuals who are probably teenagers. Those who are in their mid-teens, we'll say 15, all the way up to about the age 24, 25 is where you'll find the biggest group of individuals who are dying as a result of firearms. And in most cases, it has absolutely nothing to do with their age or them being children. They are generally engaged in other activities. Won't get into what those activities are, but just want you guys to understand that we're talking about, we're talking about, in some cases, criminals, and in some cases, we're talking about gang members. Period. We're not talking about just children, right? And we're ignoring the fact that these other activities that they might be engaged in, well, that is probably more a correlation. There's probably more related or causal to what happened to them than is the fact that they are young. So the first thing to understand is we're not talking about children. We're talking about teenagers. We're talking about young adults. The second flaw that they have in their particular study, this has to do with their comparison, how they are comparing gun violence. So they're not using a before and after comparison of states, but what they're in fact doing is they're using a comparison of one state to another. Now, mind you, they do try to put in some factors or substitute some factors in order to try and measure it out to try and make the states comparable, but in the end, it's still just not the same. It's like me saying I'm going to determine whether or not my nutritional and workout program is working by measuring my success to my wife's success and her nutritional program. Well, guess what? We're 2 different people. We have two different backgrounds. We have two different metabolisms. There are so many different factors that make us two totally different people. How can you determine whether or not I'm being successful by comparing me to my wife? Instead, you should be comparing me to me before, right? What did I weigh? What was my body fat ratio or whatever it was before I started? But they don't do that. And the fact that they don't do that leads to some very, very skewed data. It requires them to make a lot of assumptions that, quite frankly, just can't be supported, and thus makes their study largely invalid. All right, issue number 3. Issue number 3 has to do with this concept of substitution, what we call substitution effects. In other words, if people were not able to have access to firearms, what would change, right? What would change if they were not to have access to firearms? So, for example, if someone were to, take Great Britain, for example, what's going on in the UK? Currently in the UK, they're seeing a rash of murders and violence with knives. So you need to then take a look at that and say, okay, well, they banned guns, so now there's knives. So how much of a positive effect did their ban on guns really have, right? Let's take, for example, suicide, right? And the nation of Japan. Japan is number 2 amongst industrialized countries, what they term to be industrialized countries, and number 6 overall for suicides. And this is a country that has absolutely, they've banned guns. And yet, it has had absolutely or little to no impact on suicide. If the goal is to reduce suicide, then shouldn't the overall suicide numbers be lower? You would think, but no. And that's the problem. That's a fundamental problem. Is they don't take into account, well, what would potentially be the alternative? Nope, they don't take that into consideration. They don't take that into consideration one bit. All right, moving right along. So now we have an issue, and this one is probably, I'm sure you guys will really understand this one. This has to do with the bias when it comes to the interpretation of the data, right? So we already know that their data that they're using is bad, so garbage in, garbage out, but then they have a biased interpretation of that data. And one of the biggest areas where this winds up happening is when you start looking at whether or not one set of data is causative or correlative to another set of data, right? So in many of these cases, they want to say, or in this particular study, they want to say that these gun laws being in place caused a reduction in pediatric death. Well, one, we already know that that's not true, but secondly, they don't even know whether or not it was correlative, whether or not A caused B, or if it was a causative, did it cause a reduction? Because if you're saying, if I change my behavior, if we get rid of all guns, or if we increase gun control, then we will in fact, this is what they're saying, not me. They're saying if we increase gun control, then we will in fact reduce pediatric deaths. But you don't know if those laws caused that. All you know is it may be correlative. And you don't even know if it's correlative because you're not even really comparing apples to apples. You're comparing apples to dump trucks. So once again, it's the false information or the false interpretation of the data. And once again, that false interpretation comes from their natural bias from the very beginning. Guns are bad. We need to increase gun control in order to decrease people's ability to be able to own a firearm, and that way they believe they will be able to decrease gun violence. Which, by the way, yes, I know gun violence isn't a real thing because guns don't commit violence. Individuals may commit violence utilizing a firearm, or a firearm would be one of those tools. But it's important. All of this being said, I want you to understand that these are the problems with this particular study. So if anyone comes at you and they start talking about this particular study, now you know why it's bad. Now you know why you don't want to pay attention to the study and why the data in this particular study is flawed. And that's how we fight it. Remember, lies, damn lies, and statistics. This is the latter. Anyway, folks, hey, that's going to be it for today's Coffee with Craig. We very much appreciate you guys tuning in. We appreciate you liking and sharing the program, telling your friends about the Firearms Policy Coalition. We are the home in the fight for civil rights. Got to use them or you're going to lose them. You guys take care.
If you like our videos, follow, subscribe, like, and share.